From 1970 to 1979, a national campaign of family planning, characterized by the slogan, "Later, Longer, and Fewer," was initiated in response to the Chinese population reaching 800 million and nearing 1 billion. Former President Mao Zedong commented, "We are not afraid of a population of 800 million or 1 billion. After 100 years, the Chinese population will constitute 50% of the world population, a frightening fact for the Chinese economy, which physically could not keep up its production for the growing population." The post-1970 campaign relied heavily upon involuntary enforcement measures. Birth planning enforcers were planted in every village to keep thorough records of women that are of reproductive age, including records of their previous births, menstrual cycles, and use of contraceptives to prevent unauthorized pregnancies early on. China observed a decline in their fertility rate by more than half between 1971 to 1978, prompting Deng Xiaoping, the leader of the People's Republic of China, following Mao's death, to emerge when setting the goal to increase the nation's GDP per capita by 4 times its current standing by the end of the century. The creation of the one-child policy sought to control China's aggressive population growth and restore the nation's economic growth. However, as the Chinese government began to enforce the one-child policy, detrimental ramifications followed in its wake, some of which include the dismissal of reproductive rights, child rights, and gender equality, as citizen and government responsibilities fell short. To ensure that the policy was abided by, strict punishments were enforced upon citizens. If caught after giving birth to a second child, a family could be fined years or decades' worth of their income, hurting only the poor as the rich were able to afford paying the fines. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, "All people possess human rights and fundamental freedoms that governments must protect." Yet when these fines were left unpaid, the child would be unable to receive documented status, or hoku, meaning they would be restricted from their access to education, healthcare, employment, and marriage, all rights the People's Republic of China says they protect in their written constitution. In some cases, if caught pregnant with a second child, forced abortion was carried out by authorities. Besides hefty fines and forced abortions, families risked losing their jobs, being confiscated of their property, or in more extreme cases, forced IUD insertion and forced sterilization. With the implementation of this policy, fertility rates further declined and many families were left broken. It is noted that strong implementation was used to not only enforce the policy, but to also instill fear amongst families to deter them from having additional children. From the implementation of this policy, 3 main reproductive rights were violated: the right to life, the right to decide the number of children, and the right to be free from torture or other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. Mothers and families were robbed of the right to decide the number of children they wanted, as it was enforced by the government to only have 1 child. The right to life and the right to be free from torture and inhumane treatment were abolished due to family planning officials' abilities to carry out forced abortions to anyone who was pregnant with their second child. Forced abortions could occur at any time of the pregnancy. On some occasions, abortions are forced upon the mother during the 3rd trimester, which according to the Mayo Clinic begins at 28 weeks and ends at 40 weeks. The 3rd trimester follows the period in which the fetus is typically considered viable and therefore considered a patient as defined by the National Institutes of Health. An abortion of a viable fetus is, with few exceptions, never ethically justified. The abortion of a pre-viable or non-viable 3rd trimester fetus is only justifiable if the pregnant woman consents to it. Not only was consent not taken before forced abortions, but forced sterilization is a human rights violation and can constitute as an act of genocide, gender-based violence, discrimination, and torture. The utter disregard for reproductive rights demonstrates the dangerous power the Chinese government possesses and their ability to control population growth at the expense of the citizens. This should be concerning to Chinese citizens and potentially neighboring countries, as this is a prime example of the Chinese government overriding their constitution and curtailing freedoms to retain power. The implementation of this policy led to greater gender inequality. In order to carry on the family line and provide a stable life for the family, most couples preferred males over females. If that plan turned awry, couples opted for a sex-selective abortion, putting daughters up for adoption or partaking in infanticide. While not the case for all families, females were typically seen as less and were treated with disregard. This overwhelming favor of sons resulted in an unbalanced sex ratio, with a shortage of 30 million women and a surplus of men, ultimately hurting China's future demographics as seen in their increasingly elderly population and decreasing youth population due to the millions of unmarried men, depressing future economic growth without new workers to enter the workforce. As citizens, we all have a responsibility to partake in civil society and express our opinions to improve our world. Under the Chinese Communist Party, interest groups, social movements, and individual citizens that went against the regime's rule were silenced and punished. The party strategically instilled fear in the citizens, utilizing coercive enforcement techniques, leading to an immense decrease in civil society and revocation of the citizens' ability to take part in demonstrations or assemble against China's family planning policies. Women like Mao Hengfeng, a victim of forced abortion under the one-child policy, attempted to receive justice but was instead sentenced to 18 months in a labor camp, where she was later tortured, denied vitally needed medicine, and faced with life-threatening danger even after her sentence was completed. This strengthened the power the Chinese Communist Party held over the country, as they suppressed the citizens' freedom of expression and restricted their right to assemble. Many citizens took it upon themselves to aid the government in enforcing the policy by reporting women who were suspected of hiding a second child and spreading policy information, a prime example of the Chinese government regulating civil society and only allowing those who support their regime to exist. Citizens who followed their duty of obeying family planning policies received cash rewards, while those who were caught housing a second child or speaking out against the government were punished, a concerning matter that illustrates China's power to restrict constitutional freedoms and thereby citizen responsibilities, to stifle dissent in order to uphold authority and guard against perceived threats to state sovereignty. Zhu Pingzhong, a Chinese citizen who experienced the close monitoring of the birth planning enforcers, said this. Zhu Ping tells us about one particular experience of hers in the early 1980s. She took 3 days off of work because she fell sick and came back to see the birth planning enforcers in her company building, asking her coworkers whether or not she had taken time off to give birth to a second child. The birth planning enforcers encouraged her coworkers to report back to them if they found out any information, and came back multiple times within those 3 days. Additionally, the government holds a responsibility to ensure that all citizens have access to basic necessities such as food, shelter, and economic security. As China's overpopulation exceeded the government's ability to provide adequate amounts of essential resources for all citizens, they understood that if they didn't make changes to their current policies, citizens would look towards outside organizations for the resources they lacked. This would undermine China's sovereignty and show a sign of weakness, as citizens know that they cannot rely upon their own government for help. With this in mind, China set the goal to improve their GDP per capita 4 times its current status, prompting the need for the one-child policy. Although the policy was intended to improve the standard of living for Chinese citizens and fulfill the government's responsibility to provide basic necessities, it created resentment within the people and ironically hurt their future economic growth in return. Over the course of the devastating one-child policy, citizens have lost their basic human rights and ability to partake in their responsibilities. Harsh policy implementation, violations of reproductive rights, dismissing of children's rights, and restriction of citizen responsibilities all sprouted from the government's action to fulfill their responsibility of providing resources and economic stability to their citizens. Although the policy ended in 2016, we must ask ourselves, how does it still impact the world today? As Mei Fong says, China has a population that's basically too old and too male, and down the line, maybe too few. The irony lies within the fact that the policy aimed to decrease the population, but adversely, the population is now in need of a larger youth to ensure that the future will have a balanced elderly to young ratio. Furthermore, the policy led to a favoring of male offspring, yet now there is a surplus of 30 million men and a skewed male-to-female ratio in China. This means that those 30 million men will have difficulty getting married, and will therefore not have offspring, contributing to an increase in sex trafficking. With the population mainly of elderly people, the point of implementing the policy to improve the economy has diverted, and China's economy may head back towards its previous state before the horrific one-child policy. While China experienced an economic boom, consistent declines in birth rates, population growth rates, and a consistent increase in death rates have hurt China more than helped. When looking at current trends, even with the loosening of regulations and the ability for citizens to have up to 3 children, the generations of one-child children seem to want to stay in one-child families. China's ability to open up the economy while maintaining control over civil society is quite impressive, yet concerning, and as citizens we should fight to keep governments accountable and bring about change through the expression of our opinions.